Okay, we'll go ahead and get started here on our session and here in the iron. I'm going to start at the front, work our way around to the back, and then back up the left-hand side. So we'll kind of go in this direction clockwise. Just a couple housekeeping things up here on the feeder house first. One thing, we have a single belt here now. This runs both the pump and the fan. So if you have issues with your dust suction fan, do not do anything to this belt. Whereas in the past on the yellow combines, you could actually take that fan drive belt off and the second one would still run the pump. Now this is only on the combines with the heavy duty feeder house drive. The Treons do not have this. They do not have the pump. So if you break one of the blades on the prop, which we'll talk about that on the other side, but if that does happen, remove that fan blade or that whole prop assembly. Don't run with it vibrating really bad, because the last thing you want to do is compromise this drive belt, because if it does break and your pump stops, harvest stops. You cannot harvest with this pump not turning. This is the pump that circulates the oil from the gearbox through the oil coolers underneath, or through the oil cooler underneath, and it has to run continuously while you're harvesting. Otherwise, you may compromise the gearbox here, and you don't want to compromise this gearbox. Little on the pricey side. What's that?
The Treon does not have a pump.
Treon does not have this. Nope. The Treon has a feeder house drive very similar to the ones that were on the early 700 series. So no gearbox.
So don't have that gearbox.
Nope. Only the heavy duty drives on the Lexions have this, which is the majority of the Lexion combines. So most of them are all spec'd out to handle up to 12-row chopping corn heads and larger. So keep that in mind. Make sure your belts are in good shape on here. If it does break, or if something happens up here on the fan, and you need to, and the belt fails, you can get the belt from the yellow combine. If you look on that one later, you'll see the belt that just comes from the pulley down to the pump. You can get that one also and put it on here and run. Or that belt is also available from any CarQuest or Napa dealer too. It's just a standard off-the-shelf belt that you can get from the dealership or from a parts store to get back up and running. But just make sure that this pump stays running at all times. Now, secondly, how do you tension the feeder house chains on here or belts? It's done manually now. That one is still done hydraulically, so continuously. This one is done manually back here. Now last year, or since the green combines have come out, we've had occasionally folks will, the feeder house belts and chains will jump out of time, mainly the belts. It's not an issue, it's not a problem with the belts as to what was causing that. Anybody know what was probably the biggest culprit for that? Some of you may have had it happen to you. Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah, the tensioners. Everybody assumed that the chains and belts were being tensioned automatically, and they were not. We've gone back to the turnbuckle, the threaded rod in here. So please don't forget about this. So the key to this is, especially if you have belts, if it's chains, we don't have to do anything special with the chains, but the belts, the key to good belt life, conveyor belt life, is preloading them ahead of harvest and then making another adjustment say after the end of the first week. And I'll talk about that when we get over on the right-hand side. But on this side, so to adjust the feeder house chains or belts, this one's a little bit awkward to get into, as some of you may have experienced. There is a couple tricks that you can do to get into it. What makes it so awkward is the front lockdown nut. The nut that locks the drum, once you've tensioned it, locks the drum down there, is directly behind the gearbox, and the gap between the end of the bolt and the back of the gearbox is that thick. I had my finger sticking right in between there. So I cannot it's very tough to get an open end wrench back in there, or a closed end wrench, the end closed end. So what some have done, I've noticed, is you've got your threaded bolt right here, and there's a plate. So you got your threaded bolt and right here and a plate. Some of them have done, I've noticed, is they've kind of ground the corner off that to give a little more clearance in there with a wrench. Now, if it's a brand new combine, the feeder house was assembled with impact guns. So that's going to make it a little bit more difficult to get loosened up. So what I recommend doing is don't use it's a 24 mil nut, but if you got a 15/16, use a 15/16 because a 15/16 is about a half a millimeter, maybe a millimeter, 3/4 of a millimeter tighter than what a 24 is. And you're probably going to have to go on at an angle anyway. That's going to keep you from rounding that nut off when you get it broke loose in the beginning. Now there is I forgot to bring mine with me. I left it at the house, but there is a modification that you can do to a 24 mil wrench that actually will fit right back in here and work. But all it is you just take a 24 mil and put it in the vise, heat up the box end, and just give it a little bit more of a bend, and then warm up the handle and kind of give it a curve. Not so much as a actual curved set of combo wrenches, but just give it a little bit of a curve, and that will actually fit right in here. The key is just because you can't rotate that nut to tension the chain doesn't mean you got to tension it. You don't want to run with this side loose and that side tight, or just not tensioning it. You've got to run, you got to make sure they stay tight. So hopefully we'll get a fix for that. It's just the tolerances are really tight back here. But anyway, so that's all I wanted to talk about on this side. It is good occasionally to make sure you keep the multi-link cleaned. Sometimes you can push dirt and debris into the hydraulic system if you don't keep these cleaned off right here. So just every once in a while, it's maybe not a daily thing to do, but just make sure that stays fairly clean. So during operation, if you took your header off and you happen to notice that one of the slats was angled downward, so versus parallel to the floor, it was angled downward. Well, what had happened is whichever one was angled downward, that's the belt that jumped out of time. And there's an easy procedure to get it back into time, but it's absolutely necessary that you do get them back into time, that you don't run with them out of time for fear of breaking. They could be running, you could break the chain or the belt because it's in a bind. So if I do notice that my slats are out of time, it's due likely most times because the belts or chains are too loose, and it happens to both of them. It's not specific to the belts. It's just we've seen some belts do it more simply because they were never tightened. So if that does happen, the first thing that I do is I loosen the tension off the conveyor, whether it be the chains or the belts. I'll just back all the tension off until I get most of the slats laying on the floor of the feeder house. That way you can walk up to that pulley over there and rotate it really easily to get it back up into time. If it's a chain, then the next thing I do is I take the door off up here below the cab, and there's a transition plate right here. I'll just unbolt that and lift that up, and then you can lay on top of the feeder house and you can look at that drive shaft right there that runs the conveyor. You'll have the sprockets if it's a chain, you'll have the spoked wheel if it's the belts. So the first thing I'll do if it's a chain is I will just go on the front side of the sprocket and I'll put a couple deep well, whether it be a dowel or a 15 millimeter or whatever I can to plug two of the grooves up there on the pulley, the valleys there on the pulley. And then I'll just rotate the chain backwards over on the other side, and usually it takes 2 times to do that, and you'll pull it right back up into time. On the belts, I'll do the exact same thing, but the spokes, you can look on the back side of these, you can see how large the cogs are on the back side, so the gap up on the spoked wheel is a little bit larger. So I usually use like a 24, 26, and a 28. I'll use 3 of them, deep well impact sockets, and I'll just lay them right there in between each one of the spokes, and I'll do the same thing. I'll roll it back into time. Now the reason why another reason why I back all the tension off is not only does it make it easier to rotate backwards, but sometimes on the belts, once you start to get that, if you're watching it up here while somebody's rotating it, you'll see that belt is about to go into time, get back into time, and then all of a sudden the one next to it is starting to go out of time backwards. And the reason why that's happening is there's just so much tension on there that it's starting to pull the other one out. You've got so much, you've lifted up on you use the sprockets to lift up on the belts that they're starting to add leverage to the second belt. So to cure that, that's why I detension the belts. That way I'm only working with that one belt that's got the sockets underneath it. But once I get it back into time, then what do I need to do next? This is kind of just an insurance policy on it. What's that? Anybody remember?
Line?
Huh?
You have to line it up?
Nope, I got it all lined up. But now I got to do one other thing. What was that?
Tension it back up.
Not tension it yet. What's one? I guess you could tension it, but the last thing I want to do is I'll get my impact gun out, a 13 mil socket, and I'll start loosening all the nuts, all the slats on the chain or the belts. It's going to take a little bit of time, but the reason I do that is because when you get one chain or belt that's jumped out of time, it's riding on the side of that drive sprocket or spoked wheel up there. And you'll actually hear it pop in the cab. If it's a chain, you'll definitely hear it pop occasionally. And it's in a bind. So for example, if I jump that far left one out of time, all these three over here are trying to move that direction. They're trying to follow it. So everything's drifting the direction of the pull of the belt that's out or chain that's out of time. So you got to get that out of there. That's not a CLAAS thing. That's industry wide. Any combine has this issue. So the first thing you'll do is just start loosening all these nuts until the slats rattle on the chain or the belts, and you'll get about halfway through. And especially if it's a chain, and you'll hear that chain relax. It'll actually make another popping sound as it just kind of settles down inside the feeder house. Once you hear that, start tightening them all back up, and then away you go. But if you don't do that, the odds are very high that at the end of that day, after you got everything lined back up and tightened up, you take your header off, and you'll notice that slat has dropped down again. Because it's still in that bind. So you got to get that bind out of there, and it's on any type of conveyor like this. The belts are a lot more resilient than the chains. Their breaking point's much higher because they actually do stretch, but they also return back, whereas a chain can only stretch so much before it pops and breaks. So that's the other thing too. You want to make sure you keep everything all in time as well, because you don't want those belts or chains to break, especially while you're harvesting, because 9 times out of 10 they wind up way up in here, and that's very hard to get out of there. So we want to make sure this stays in good health. Now, proper tension on the chain is always done when the drum is in the down position. So you'll have to lower the drum in the down position using the adjustments on the left and right hand side, and then you measure the slat. The third and fourth slat back from the front should just barely be touching the floor. On the belts, what we recommend is preloading them ahead of harvest. Make them just a little bit tighter. The owner's manual says for both chains and belts to adjust them so that the third and fourth slat barely touches the floor when the front drum is down. But on the belts, it's good to just give them a little bit more extra tension, especially before harvest. Or if you ran last year, do the same thing before harvest this year, even though it's used. Just get it a little bit over tight. So instead of the third and fourth slat laying on the feeder house, the floor of the feeder house, make them fairly straight. And all that is basically about another 3/4 of a turn on the nut over here that'll push it a little bit further forward to lift that sag up out of there. And then once you've got that, and you can actually do that, eyeball that one with the drum in the up position, so you won't have to take the time and lower it down, but you can eyeball that. But we don't want to over tighten them. I mean, you don't want to put like 2 or 3 more turns on here, because you could run the risk of pulling the bolts through on the slats through the belts. You got to watch out for that. And you'll actually hear a really loud clicking sound on the belts if they are that tight. So we don't want that tight. We just want you to get about 3/4 of a turn on here just to get them straight on when you look at it from the front. If it's in the up position, you can see when the bottom belts are straight. Don't over tighten them. Just make them a little bit, just tighten them a little bit more so they're straight on the bottom. And then after the first week of harvest, do that one more time. On the chains, do it as needed, but on the belts, do it after about another week. Just give them another, maybe a half turn or 3/4 of a turn just to get them back flat again. And then the odds of having to do that again are greatly reduced throughout harvest. So. Yep, when I look inside here, if it's raised up, the bottom side will be pretty flat. So, but if you do get them too tight, one indication that they are too tight is right here. One, you could hear that clicking on the belts. You might hear the clicking sound. It's really loud. You don't want to hear that. The other one is right here. One way to tell if I got it too tight is this will be up and you'll see daylight under this stop. You do not want to see daylight under that stop. That is the bottom stop for the cruise pilot pressure roller. And if you get it too tight, what it's going to do is it's starting to lift up on the drum and you'll reduce the travel on that drum. So you don't want to make sure that you don't get that you don't want to see any daylight underneath that rubber stop right there. And you can get that belt fairly tight without that coming up off that stop. So you don't want to do that.